In today's episode of Today in World War II, January 11th, those pesky Finns pinned down an entire Soviet division. German Stuka dive bombers sink a Royal Navy cruiser in the Mediterranean. The Dutch, having no choice, destroy over 700 oil wells to keep them from being captured by the Japanese. Speaking of the Japanese invade Kuala Lumpur in their unstoppable drive to take Singapore. FDR becomes the first U.S. president in the history to travel by airplane. Well, that sounds antiquated, doesn't it? The U.S. Fast Carrier Task Force absolutely devastated the Japanese in Vietnam. And finally, the British forces do a little help, give a little help to the Americans in the Battle of the Bulge by taking La Roche on Ardennes in Belgium, which was northwest of Bastogne. Let's get started, okay? So on January 1st, 1940, the Finns pinned down the Soviet 168th Division north of Lake Ladoga. Now, just so you understand a little bit how this works in geography over there, uh, most of the major fighting occurred in the Karelian Peninsula. The Finns chose that for a reason because defensively, it was very difficult, if not impossible, to outflank their Mannerheim line. On the left, you had the Gulf of Finland. On the right, you had Lake Ladoga. And while yes, as it got, this was no deep depth of winter, it was very cold. The ice did freeze. It could have been possible to flank the Finns. In fact, the Finns were flanking them all the time with their ski troops, but the Soviets really were road bound at this time. Now, north of Lake Ladoga, that was another axis of offensive, but that was a tough one for the Soviets because there were very little roads in that territory. Um, and they were just throwing armored divisions and paratroopers in, and they were just getting enveloped by the countryside. The Finns didn't have to do much on that at all to keep them at bay. So in this case, the Soviets had sent the 168th Division into the wilderness above Lake Ladoga, and the Finnish Fourth Corps really stuck it to them. So what else was new? The first 2 months of the war, the Finns just absolutely gave more than they got. Spoiler alert, that eventually changed. What's not going to change is my heartfelt desire that you subscribe to my channel and you click the little bell that will give you advance warning when I'm dropping one of my videos, which as you see, I drop these things every day and will continue to do so until this project is finished. So just do me a favor, subscribe, become a member of my club, and enjoy it. On January 11th, 1941, the German Stukas got a little bit frisky there against two Royal Navy cruisers. They attacked the HMS Gloucester and the HMS Southampton about 120 miles east of Sicily. They hit the Gloucester with one 500 kilogram bomb. Now, unfortunately for them, it didn't explode, but it still took out some of the sailors there. But the Southampton, it was not as lucky. It got hit with two 500 kilogram bombs, and it had to be abandoned and scuttled because there was no way in the world that cruiser was coming back. So, I'll tell you, the Stuka dive bombers, when they had adequate fighter cover, they were ship killers, and this is just an example of what the Royal Navy had to contend with during most of the Mediterranean campaign because they were deadly again if they didn't have fighter cover, and even when they did, they still. I mean, we can see in later battles the Mediterranean, even when they took out, they either heavily damaged or sank some, at least one Royal Navy carrier. So it was, the Mediterranean was a tough naval battleground, and kind of like the Pacific was in the beginning, the first year before the American industrial might pretty much just wore down the Japanese through attrition. Now, one thing that you will never get worn down with attrition is my sincere desire and hope that you will like every time I do a video. Just go down below the screen. There's a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Click the thumbs up. That would be awesome. And leave a comment. And as we know about, there's this very capricious woman. Her name is the YouTube algorithm, and we want her to help me and not hurt me. And engagement is the way to do that. So if you do those two things on my videos, then I'm set and I can get this out to more people, which is really what I want. So I appreciate that. Thank you. On January 11th, 1942, the Japanese are continuing their long and very successful offensive from December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. Their whole desire was they wanted to sweep down into South Asia, capture all of the colonies, the British colonies. Of course, we still controlled the Philippines and the Dutch in Dutch East Asia, which is now Indonesia, because they were resources rich. Japan was resources poor. They did not have any petroleum capabilities or reserves, and they needed to sweep down and capture these things and then set up their shipping to supply them because that was the only way they were going to survive. The U.S. had installed or instituted a very strict oil embargo against the Japanese, which kind of precipitated the war starting. And they had two choices. They could go north to Siberia or they could go south. They decided to go south, and this was part of their campaign. And the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, was their main target. On this date, they landed on an island off of Borneo, and which was an oil-producing area for the Dutch. And they decided that there's no way the Dutch were going to be able to hold off the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy and Japanese Air Force. So they decided that they were going to have to surrender. But before they did that, they didn't want these oil wells to fall into Japanese hands. So they destroyed about 700 oil wells. Now, as we'll see in a couple of days in these videos, it did not end well for the Dutch for that. The Japanese were not happy. And then, of course, the Japanese continued. They had their Marines, their naval landing forces. They took a couple of sites on Celebes, and they also had about 350 Japanese paratroopers landed and captured a seaplane base and an airfield. So they were moving forward very quickly in Indonesia. Speaking of moving forward very quickly, in the same vein, on January 11th, 1942, the Japanese entered Kuala Lumpur, which was the capital of the Federated Malay States, which we call Malaysia now. The British and the colonial Commonwealth troops, they did not stand and fight. They just basically retreated, evacuated to Singapore. Unfortunately, when you retreat that quickly, you tend to leave a lot of your equipment, and that's what happened here. They left an incredible amount of supplies and ammunition, just handed it to the Japanese, didn't destroy it, and that's the sign of a demoralized army, a panicked army, and that's what happened. And so it did not end well for the Brits and their colonial troops in this campaign in Malaysia and in Singapore. And we'll get into that as the weeks move forward in this series. And on January 11th, 1943, Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, became the first U.S. president to ever fly or travel by airplane while in office. Boy, it doesn't seem that long ago, yet that was 80 years ago. That was a big deal. That was like the first time a president had ever flown. Just shows you how quickly things have advanced technologically since then. In this case, he was flying to Morocco to meet with Churchill at the Casablanca conference, and we'll talk more about, what decisions were made at that time there. But that was just noteworthy. Again, if we ever do World War II trivia, Trivial Pursuit, then that's also going to be a question, I'm sure, about the first president to ever fly in while in office in an airplane. So, and then on January 11th, 1944, that fast U.S. Or that Task Force 58 TF-58 with all the fast carriers, the 5 or 6 S6 class carriers, and I think six or six, 5 or 6 light carriers, 700 aircraft, battleships, cruisers. Nobody could stand up to that task force. I mean, think about this. This is 1944, and they were, attacking Vietnam. Indochina at the time, that's what it was called. And they were going after the Cam Ranh Bay, the ports, the Da Nang, the airfields, and they just went through like death is riding through them with the scythe, the 6 horsemen of the apocalypse, because the Japanese had nothing that they could do to stop that task force, those relentless attacks, and they absolutely went through, like my father said, they went through the Japanese and Indochina like shit through a goose, and it's about time. But this is where you get around to the reap what you sow part of the war for the Japanese. It only got worse, the next 18 months or 16 months until the war ended. And finally, on January 11th, 1945, British forces captured La Roche en Ardennes in Belgium, which is northwest of Bastogne. And just as a reminder that 99% of the fighting that was done in the Battle of the Bulge was done by American troops. So they attacked American sector. The German strategy was they wanted to attack on the division between the British forces and the American forces. They wanted to drive a wedge through them and cross the Meuse River, get to Antwerp, and they felt like that by doing that, they could spoil the alliance between the Americans and the British, that somehow Western Europe, the Western Allies would sue for peace. Delusional, we know that, of course, but from a military point of view, you know, the main thrust of the attack was against the Americans. The Even though in the initial days of the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower made Montgomery or put him in charge of the forces on the northern pocket of the Battle of the Bulge, the British really didn't do that much fighting. It was mostly American, like I said, but in this case, as they started to push the Germans back, then the British started pushing them back as well. And this was a noteworthy capture of a small town northwest of Bastogne. Now they were moving to push them back. I think that strategy was unnecessary. I don't think it showed any military aggressiveness. And Patton was begging Eisenhower to do the bold move and drive up and cut the bulge off into a pocket and then eliminate it, which would have been great. It would have made it much easier to get into Germany after that. But Eisenhower once again showed no imagination when it came to tactics. He says, "No, we're just going to push it back on a wide front," which meant more casualties. The two American generals in the war, I would say MacArthur and Patton by far were the best generals in their tactical um, tactical abilities, and they tended to have their troops take less casualties because they just had superior tactics and strategy. And this was another case of Eisenhower not having that gift. His gifts were organizational, keeping alliances going, not so much on the generaling side, as they say. Well, I want to thank you very much for watching this video. I really enjoy giving them to you, so I'll see you tomorrow.